So, here we are in lockdown again. But maybe there's a silver lining to the problems that we face at the moment. Maybe this is an opportunity to try a new hobby, to read an interesting book, to watch an exciting and engaging film, or to listen to a piece of music you've never heard before. Maybe it's an opportunity to listen to an interesting conversation with people who've grown up in Teasdale and gone on to do some fascinating things. My name is Simon Henderson. I am Head of History and Sixth Form at Teasdale School, and this is episode 1 of Made in Teasdale.
Made in Teasdale.
And we actually sat there one night watching John Wayne's stage ghost film projected onto the wall while looking down at the scene below.
It is absolutely fascinating seeing inner city London children dropped into the middle of a working farm.
I have very fond memories of growing up in Teasdale. I mean, living in the countryside and having, loads of fresh air, loads of space to play.
It really is the case that if you come from County Durham, and in my case have lived in southwest London for 40 years, County Durham is still what I call home.
Made in Teasdale.
I was driving into school the other day, just coming down towards Raby. I looked to my left, and the sun, just the early morning sun, just a daybreak, was shining on the snow in the hills over to my left. As I came down the hill to my right, the light was bouncing off the windows in the castle, and deer were running in the grounds outside the castle. And I thought to myself, as I often do, I'm pretty lucky to work in such a beautiful part of the world. But what makes Teasdale really special is the people. And this series is going to focus on a number of those people who were raised in Teasdale and who have gone on to do some fascinating things. And that is certainly the case with my guest for this first episode of the podcast, Mark Sizik, who recently won an MBE for his services to education, and he works as an executive head teacher of a multi-academy trust in South London. Hi Mark, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to do this today. It's great.
Thanks very much for agreeing to it. I wonder, I know that you told me that you left Teasdale School in 1991, which seems probably like a lifetime ago. Can you talk to us a little bit about growing up in Cutherston, what it was like in Cutherston Primary School back in the late 70s, early 80s, and then what life was like in Teasdale School?
You're definitely making me sound really old now, but I guess it was a lifetime ago. Cutherston back then, it physically looks exactly the same, and I haven't been back in the building, but you could literally walk past it, and it could be the school from sort of 40 years ago. It was a small school, about 60, 70 children, probably very similar to how it is today. And I think, some of my favourite memories, and I think things that are very unlike education days, I was fortunate to have the same teachers right the way through my time. And so Mrs. Linton and Mrs. Sewell were my key two teachers that took me from infants right the way through to year 6. And obviously when you have an education like that, you're very fortunate because the bonds that you make with those teachers do literally stay with you for the rest of your life. And I think, many things that shaped the person I am today and the education sort of principles that I lived by came from those very early years in school. And I tend to feel that much of what I learned there, I sort of applied to what I do in London. People often talk about the school that I run here has been like a little oasis, because it's just got so many little bits that kind of remind me of my education. So I feel quite fortunate in that way.
Do you have any memories of Teasdale School back in the day? A particular teacher or a particular anecdote?
Well, two teachers that always come to mind when I think and talk about Teasdale. Miss Sharp, Dr. Sharp, as I understand today, was my science teacher for a number of years, and absolutely used to love particularly my biology lessons, and she was always particularly great at hands-on experiments and really getting you to understand the detail from learning firsthand rather than learning from books. And I think, definitely something that comes across in my work today. And Mrs. Madison, who was my German teacher, and she took me through German for GCSE and A level, and the opportunities we had through those courses, we went abroad a number of times to places in Germany to visit and improve language. And I think those memories in particular stick with me forever.
So how does a young man growing up in Hudderston and going to tea, how does he then end up several years later in the south of London?
Well, I would probably say I had my dad to blame for that, but he would probably strongly disagree. But I think to answer that bit straight off, my dad always said to me, you take the first job that comes along. Getting a job is really important after education. And once you're in work, you can then start to think more about where you want to take it. And so the first job that came along was a music teacher in a very deprived school in Fulham. And that's kind of jumping to the end of the story. But I think from a very, very early age, I wanted to be a teacher. Consider myself to be really fortunate, because lots of people don't know what they want to do when they grow up. And they tend to sort of focus on the subjects that they like the most, and the end game is never really in their minds. And that to me often seems the wrong way around. But I knew from the age of probably 7 that I wanted to be a teacher. And I absolutely loved music. I, was fortunate to have sort of private music lessons in piano and vocal and things. And I sort of geared myself towards going to do a music and education degree in Lincoln. Again, very focused on where I wanted to study, did a lot of work, a lot of research, a lot of visiting. And Lincoln was I suppose, the college, the university that was closest to the kind of community and upbringing that I'd had. It wasn't too big, it wasn't too small. Had the right number of things that I wanted to get from that course. And then really just, the jobs started coming out, and London was where I ended up. It was meant to be for a year. And I intended to relocate shortly afterwards. But, as life would have it, things just sort of rolled on. And 25 years later, I'm still in London, still teaching, and now running, I suppose, a multi-academy trust with 4 or 5 schools in it.
Wow. And
so
in a wonderful moment of serendipity, as I'm speaking to you, the room that I'm in, I can see out of the window to where our nature reserve is. Dr. Sharp has just gone into the nature reserve with a large supply of bird food, and she's restocking the bird feeders.
There you go.
So you talk about running now a multi-academy trust in London. So I'm thinking, sitting here in Teasdale in a relatively small rural school. What do you find the contrast living and working where you are now in such a huge metropolis with growing up in a very rural area? Are there things about Teasdale that you miss? Or would you say that you've become such a Londoner that you're almost like a native down there now and you don't miss Teasdale as much?
Oh, I spend a lot of time in Teasdale. All my family, my friendship groups still exist very strongly in Teasdale. And so I would say pretty much every holiday and a few weekends in between, I find myself back with the family. My parents still in Cudderston, which is where I was born and bred. I think what changed, I suppose, is seeing when I came to London, the educational offer was pretty dreadful, and there was some major issues about sort of children who were not really receiving the quality of education that I had as a child, and I really wanted to get involved in that. And I suppose I spent the first few years being heavily involved in families who were from all sorts of deprived backgrounds, challenging circumstances, and I suppose I learned pretty quickly that I had quite a lot to offer. I brought with me, a solid education and an experience of living, I suppose, on the North Pennines that you don't get in London. And I think that allowed me to bring something to education that was different. And every year I was here, I suppose I always thought I was going to come back, but I suppose it just got more and more embedded in it. The relationships with the families, the children, got stronger and stronger, and it's pretty much led to where I am today.
You could say in you've taken actually what you learned in Teasdale. You've taken that bit of Teasdale with you, and it's that makes you successful where you are, because it's those principles and those ideas that you learned in this area that you've tried to apply to where you are in a very different environment.
I would say that's pretty true. I think when I arrived at Chesterton and I took the headship, Chesterton was very much a largish area in terms of outdoor space, but it was just tarmac. Mm-hmm. And so I just started to rip it up, and I put wildlife areas in, and we've got animals that we used to have, chickens and ducks, and we used to have rabbits and all sorts of things that were always considered to be too difficult to manage in a London school environment. Mm-hmm. We design different areas. We do forest schools, so we do lots of kind of things I did as a child out in the outdoors. I suppose experiences from Cubs and Scouts, my involvement there. But we take a lot of our children out to, we take them on school journeys. So one of the things that I put in place quite early was establishing a link with a farm outside of London. It's actually a charity called Farms for City, and we take our children out there for a week every year. They have 7 days on a working farm. Great. And it is absolutely fascinating seeing inner city London children dropped into the middle of a working farm, in the way that we know a working farm. And the kids are just different. There are opportunities to roll down hills in fields, the opportunities to collect eggs, to learn where eggs come from. One of my favourite lines was having that conversation, where do eggs come from? Tesco's. Mm-hmm. And actually, the kids genuinely thinking that their food comes from a shop. And so introducing things like that, things that I just took for granted, has been really powerful in the education we provided.
Now, I know that you've mentioned that you are you're in charge of a multi-academy trust now, and I also a prestigious award. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I'll tell you about the multi-academy trust. Chesterton has been, a successful school for many, many years. It was the worst performing school in the London Borough of Wandsworth. And we took it from the worst performing school to one of the highest performing schools, not just in Wandsworth, but nationally, featuring in, the top 100 schools nationally. I think last year we were 104, which is a bit of a shame, but we have sort of won those accolades. We've run national programs, teaching schools, English hubs, maths hubs. We do all sorts of different things, and and that just allows us to grow from strength to strength. In the last year, we've been focusing very heavily on remote learning for our families, and we did a piece of work for the Department of Education around one of the national phonics programs, Letters and Sounds. And it's been a program that's needed some support for some time, and we agreed to film daily lessons to go out to families nationally. It's amazing. We've had 3-4 million hits on YouTube from the volume of lessons, and we have tens of thousands of subscribers and hundreds of thousands of sort of straightforward views. So statistically, it's been an absolute success, and I think everyone would agree that the key to education is reading, is language. If you can teach children to read, and you can teach them to read well, and not just to read, but to actually develop the love of reading, and to be self-learners as a result of that, then it opens up education in a way that you don't understand until you can read. And so, one of the biggest concerns has been around children not learning to read, and obviously following the closures of schools during COVID, the youngest children have been the ones that have suffered because they've needed the greatest input around reading. That said, so the MBE, I guess, was a phenomenal surprise. How did I get from Teasdale to getting an MBE? Not entirely sure, but anyway, here we are. So to get the MBE, it's a bit like Secret Squirrel. You get a message out of the blue a few weeks before it gets announced, and couldn't believe it. Awarded an MBE for service to education, and obviously work around the COVID has supported that. But I think it's been, I suppose, a longer journey in terms of the other pieces of work that I've been involved in. I've been very fortunate. I've had some great opportunities, and I've travelled the world, through the education process, and been to see some amazing education systems in China. Been out to America. Can't even think where I've been. But, and all of those experiences I've been able to bring back and put them back into the system. And I think, one of my favourite things really is working wider than the school, and it's working nationally, working with schools up and down the country. Schools, in fact, in and around Darlington through the English Hub programme, had quite a lot of involvement recently. So, yeah.
Well, even though I haven't been in one of your schools, and even though I've only been chatting to you for about 15 minutes, I feel confident that I can declare that I'm very certain that MBE is very well deserved, because I think you can hear in your voice the passion for education and for kids' education that you have, and also how you've tried to take your own life experiences and help students. I love that idea of London kids going to a farm for a week and rolling down hills and doing the things that no doubt you did when you were a kid in Cutherstone.
Took for granted.
Yeah. So we now find ourselves back in another lockdown, possibly in a more difficult moment than we were on the first one, because we're now in the middle of winter rather than at the beginning of spring. What advice would you offer to students and their parents who are going through another period of remote learning?
Wow. I think education's education. I think it's a challenging time, but it's also an interesting time. And I think parents have learned a lot about education when their children have been at home. I think teachers have learned a lot about how children interact and work from home. I think we've all learned a lot about what technology can add to our lives in a way that perhaps we wouldn't have known without this. I think there's been some really interesting developments for schools. I think in terms of advice, I think first and foremost we need to keep ourselves fit and healthy. I think it's absolutely key that we do everything that we need to do to make sure that our families are well protected and they're safe. I think schools are really well equipped now, and they're really well set up to roll out remote learning in whatever that may look like for an individual school. It looks differently looks different up and down the country. I think, that engagement with the teachers in the schools, I think, is absolutely key. And I know that there's so much happening in terms of delivery of remote lessons, online learning, one-to-one catch-up sessions. I've seen some fantastic, whole school assemblies taking place on Zoom and Teams, where the entire school comes together in different bubbles. And it really is different. I've seen hundreds of children's cats. I've met grandparents. I have, had tours of houses. I've been outside to see all sorts of parts of children's lives that you don't necessarily have time for or get to when you are working within a school. And I think that has been, truly fascinating to learn more about the children that we work with and their families. And I think it all just adds to the whole mix of the education system. I've been reading a little bit over the last few weeks, and I've engaged in one of our Year 6 books. And if you haven't read it, Skellig by David Almond is just a fantastic read. And then one for me to get me through and out of lockdown, so one for the parents, Notes from a Small Island by Bill Bryson. It's quite an old book, but actually thinking about the fact that international travel is probably off the radar for a bit. Getting to explore our lovely island, and he does it so well. So a couple of books from me.
Great. Well, thanks very much for your time, Mark. It's really appreciated. I've had a fascinating conversation, and I hope that the people who are listening to this also find it fascinating.
Thank you.
My thanks again to Mark for giving up this time to speak to me for the first episode of this podcast. If you've enjoyed what you've listened to, if you found it interesting, please share it with friends. Please point people in the direction of the podcast. There'll be another episode coming out later next week. If you feel as though you have an interesting story that you would like to tell, please get in touch. Or if you know somebody who you think has an interesting story that people would like to hear, then get in touch on their behalf. Until the next time, take good care, stay safe. Bye-bye.